We start our story in the University of Missouri with Professor of Criminology David Klinger. Klinger is a former police officer with the Los Angeles Police Department who left in '84, ultimately for reasons surrounding just one event that happened a few years earlier. His book Into the Kill Zone explores the before, during and after experiences of deadly shootings through the eyes of 80 police officers from 19 police departments across 4 states. But it's his personal introduction of his own experience that I want to share with you. He recounts the harrowing experience in 1981 that he would obsess about in his mind for years after the fact. The shock of having taken a life stayed with him for a long time and forced him eventually to leave the force to study what was so difficult for him to forget. Klinger begins. Edward Randolph was 26 years old when I killed him. I was 23. I first laid eyes on him less than a minute before I shot him, so I didn't know his name, how old he was, or anything else about him before I ended his life. I didn't even get a good look at his face before I pulled the trigger, and he died a few minutes after that. I was about 15 feet away when his heart stopped, watching the paramedics tending to the wounds that I had inflicted moments before. They had all come from a single bullet that slammed into his left side just below his armpit, bored a hole through his left lung, nicked his aorta, and tunneled through his right lung before coming to a stop just under the flesh on the right side of his chest. In trying to cope with the emotional aftermath of the incident, it struck Klinger how pervasive the symptoms were among officers who had had similar experiences. It was commonly called post-shooting trauma, a form of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Officers who are involved in shootings can experience a variety of short and long-term reactions, he says, such as recurrent thoughts about the incident, a sense of numbness, nausea, sadness, crying, and trouble sleeping. But more curious to Klinger were the memories of shootings themselves. Being witness to shootings can produce an unusual range of sensations, a sense of disbelief that the incident is happening, intrusive thoughts about irrelevant matters, and, crucially to today's episode, sensory distortions such as a narrowing of the visual field, decreased auditory acuity, and altered perceptions of time. But is time-distorted recall reliable? Did objective time actually alter in that moment? Or perhaps heightened senses alter the intake of pertinent information in a moment of threat? A change in subjective time? If so, why? And how much of this distortion is actually retrospective, a distortion of memory rather than things as they happened? To many of us, time is a constant and fundamental property of reality, and this is intuitive to us. We have faith that so long as the clock on the wall has working batteries, it's going to be reliable enough for us to get to work on time. But stories similar to what we've just heard of intense sensory experiences, often in moments of highly threatening situations, are often coupled with sudden distortions in our typically reliable matrix of existence that is built upon the premise that time is sequential, a past, a present, and a future. It's a fascinating mystery that we're going to try and pry apart in today's episode. With the story out of the way, we're on to part 2, science, to see what objective truths the story might highlight. But first, with an all-essential caveat. Science isn't broken, but it's a hell of a lot harder than we give it credit for, to paraphrase the data analysis blog 538. What does this mean? Well, humans are not rational creatures. Scientists are no different. We see patterns, we unconsciously jump to conclusions. We screen data to confirm our hypotheses, and as a result struggle to replicate findings. Point is, just because I mention the word science doesn't mean you should take these studies as gospel. Lessons can be taken, but sleep with one eye open. Correlation is not causation. Read my favourite book in the world to understand more. We know that time can sometimes seem to be distorted in the brain. Ask anyone who can't get to sleep or who was shocked to realise their holiday had ended and they have work tomorrow. That subjective time is not a constant is not news, and we're going to understand why this is in more detail shortly. We'll start though with what science tells us about objective time, that is, the true flow of time without a brain to process it. It's intuitive to think that objective time is a constant, but is it really? As I said earlier, so long as the battery doesn't run out on the wall clock, we like to think that time is pretty much a constant objectively. And this is a good example of Isaac Newton's concept of absolute time, coined in the 17th century. The idea that outside of the brain, time exists independently of any perceiver. Then Einstein came along with his theory of relativity to completely throw this premise into cosmic disarray. Very simply, Einstein presented what he called space-time, the combination of space and time, and the observation that large bodies in space, such as planets, can distort the fabric of space, consequently distorting the fabric of time. If space is affected, then time necessarily is as well, meaning that objective time is not a constant. Consider a melon placed in the center of a trampoline. This is Earth, and we see that the melon weighs down the entire fabric of the trampoline around it. We now roll a marble around the outside so that it sweeps around the melon, gradually getting closer and closer to it. The marble is our clock. Einstein showed us that if absolute time was objective truth, the marble would not be affected by the planet without direct physical impact, and time on the clock would remain constant. But given that space and time are inextricably connected, the marble is attracted to the Earth. We call this effect gravity, the warping of space-time, and can correlate the pull of gravity with the degree of time distortion. Einstein's big insight was to realize that gravity is acceleration. And from this insight, he realized that the stronger the gravitational pull on a clock and the speed with which it moved, whether it's from a planet or another massive object, the slower time itself would be from the center of the object, gradually weakening as we move away from that center. This is how we know that the higher you live above sea level, that is a point further from the center of the planet than at ground level, the faster you should age. This was verified by the world's most accurate clock in 2010. Although a person would only age about 90 billionths of a second faster over a 79-year lifetime. There's a lot more to the general theory of relativity, but for the intentions of this short episode, we've learned enough. I'll finish our foray into objective time with a quote from science writer Z.R. Murali on perhaps my favourite little science publication, Nautilus.com. Mounting evidence shows that at the most basic level of reality, time is an illusion, and stranger still, that time doesn't really exist. So now that we know that both subjective and objective time are variable, we know that not only does our own experience of the world distort the passing of our lives, but even the clock on the wall and the time it tells is an illusion. It's relative. It's not absolute. But the difference between relative objective time and perceptual subjective time is a big one. For a human, objective time is relatively consistent so long as we stay on Earth. But our perceptions distort this seemingly constant speed of time to a large degree. The only reason most people insist that time is not an illusion is because our clocks report objective time, as we've explored already, keeping us calibrated. So let's look into the perception of time, the subjective processing and tapestry of the past, the present, and the future. We're going to explore this through two broad distortions that occur in our brains over time: memory time distortion in the perceived past and future, and arousal time distortion in the perceived present. Essentially, the most realistic interpretation of time we have is with the present, the closest we are to what we call objective reality. In the past, perceived objectivity is slipping away, as with the rouse of objectivity which keeps our experience of time calibrated, and so too with the future, which is an extrapolation of the past. We'll start now by looking into arousal in the present as a distorter of time, but bear in mind that memory of the past and extrapolated to the future is going to be an exaggerated version of arousal distortion as we forget things over time and memories change. So, arousal. What are we talking about? We're talking about how the present environment changes our perception of time through changes in our emotional state. Facial expressions, observed movement, music, conscious effort, even static artwork, as we'll see. These all change the perception of time against a neutral state, which might be standing alone in a room with our eyes closed. In 1999, the cognitive neuroscientist Patrick Haggard demonstrated subjective time warping, where subjects perceived voluntary movements as occurring later, and their sensory consequences as occurring earlier than they actually did. Here's how that worked. Subjects watched a clock on a computer screen and were asked to indicate when they consciously pressed a button or when they passively heard a tone. When the pressing of the button was followed by a tone 250 milliseconds later, participants typically said their button press happened 15 milliseconds later than when no tone sounded. This sounds trivial perhaps, but place it in context with this. Participants also estimated that the tone went off 46 milliseconds earlier when they had pressed the button versus when they hadn't. Basically, the conscious experience of causing the tone to go off by pressing the button reduced perceived and remembered time between the two events. Haggard called this effect intentional binding, referencing the conscious intentionality of the experiment. Fortunately, this experiment has been repeated numerous times since the initial findings, and every time the same results were found. This effect is measured too, not just when conscious effort is involved, but in the example of viewing images. Another study published in 2011 by neuropsychologist Sylvie droit-volet in France showed images of two ballerinas to a group of volunteers. One ballerina is at rest, and the other is executing a dance routine depicting movement. First, each subject was shown what was called a neutral image, lasting either 0.4 seconds or 1.6 seconds. This was done multiple times so that the subjects began to distinguish between the two time delays. Then one of the two photos of ballerinas was shown for between 0.4 and 1.6 seconds, and repeated with the second photos of the ballerina. Then one of the two photos of ballerinas was shown for between 0.4 and 1.6 seconds, and repeated with the second photo of the ballerina. After each viewing, the subject was asked which time delay they thought was associated with the image they saw. The findings were conclusive. The ballerina in mid-movement seemed to last longer on screen than it actually did. That is, perceived motion, or in this case anticipated motion, altered the perception of time itself in the subject's mind. During periods of heightened perceptual engagement, such as being consciously engaged, perceiving movement, or being all consumed by music, activity in the prefrontal cortex shuts down. This is the most recently evolved area of the brain which governs executive control. You might think of it as the brakes on impulse. It's where we can think in the third person about our behavior. So what's happening really is that, in a sense, we are losing self-awareness. For just a moment it seems, as the study's neuroscientist Ilan Goldberg describes, we lose ourselves. We lose our calibration on time, and this happens more often than we'd like to think. It's that fight or flight moment when monitoring the passing of time is not so important when our lives are possibly at threat or we're being summoned to take action. Very broadly here, an object moving toward you is perceived as longer in duration than the same object that is not moving or that is receding from you. That can be sound, it can be something you touch, it can be something you see. So with that in mind, let's take a step back now and consider the past and future aside from the present. If you remember, I said that the past and future differ from the present in regards to the intensity of distortion. The present is the closest we get to objective reality, if you like, and as time goes on, those memories become further distorted as neural networks fade, new memories are formed, and new narratives are assembled in the brain as it tries to make sense of the memories that we do have in a process called temporal binding. Aside from this variance, there is no difference between different human perspectives on time. As Einstein said himself, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. The past, present, and future technically exist right now. We just can't see them all right now. Neuroscientist David Eagleman is perhaps the best known researcher of past memory and its effects on time perception. His most famous study, published in 2007, explored whether time really slowed down during a frightening event, something that many people can relate to when recalling a harrowing experience. Time seems to slow down to almost a crawl. For the study, Eagleman dropped subjects 150 foot at up to 70 miles an hour onto a trampoline. Participants were asked, first of all, to estimate how long the fall was when they themselves were falling, secondly, during only observation of someone else falling, and then, retrospectively, thinking back to how long the fall took when they did it earlier. His findings were insightful. There was little to no difference when appraising time presently in the fall and observation scenarios. However, the retrospective scenario later on revealed far more distortion. It was expected that time would slow down for the subject falling versus observing, but it was identical, which tells us, presently at least, the heightened arousal of fear does little to distort our time perception. What Eagleman concluded was that rather than the experience slowing down time in the present, a point at which instinct has typically hijacked the conscious brain, the slowing down of time is actually attributed to a more densely packed set of memories associated with the experience. When thinking back, retrospectively, denser memories, thus effectively more memories of an event, are misattributed as having lasted longer. To give a concrete example, 100 photos of a 100-meter race versus only 15 photos of a 1500-meter race does not mean that the 100-meter race took longer, but retrospectively, the brain makes a miscalculation. It thinks that more photos means longer duration, not that perhaps more photos were taken. Further, this is compounded by the tendency we often have to obsessively think about the experience over and over, strengthening neural pathways representing those memories, increasing the immediate availability of those memories, and so giving disproportionate weight to the experience over other events. EAGLEMAN says frightening events are associated with richer and denser memories, and the more memory you have of an event, the longer you believe it took. He states that this illusion is related to the phenomenon that time seems to speed up as you grow older. When you're a child, you lay down rich memories for all your experiences. When you're older, you've seen it all before and lay down fewer memories. It's these fewer memories which are misconstrued as time passing more quickly, even though at the time the perception of time passing hadn't changed from when you were young. It's all about the memories. It's this added distortion to some extent which separates the present from the past and the future in time perception. So what might we be able to take away from the episode today? Well, as with many of these videos, the underlying circuitry driving these effects is outside our direct control. But consider this. Consider that by going to the same office for 25 years, the brain implicitly learns that it doesn't need to be as productive in its memory creation. The place is already mapped out in memory, the daily interactions are fairly routine and mundane. From this perspective, it makes sense that memories would be laid more thinly, and that our retrospective account of that will conclude fewer memories for the day, with time passing more quickly. There's just nothing of special note to remember which might establish temporal guideposts with which to orient the sense that the beginning is far removed from the end. That might seem depressing if you have a routine job, but now you might realize that to slow down time, you need more novel experience in your life. Arrange more weekends away to places you haven't been before. Hire a foreign language tutor. If you need a reason to try something new while feeling apathetic, why not consider it on the strength of being able to slow down time? How cool is that? That way you can stop kicking yourself for another year going by without having achieved as much as you wanted to. By trying new stuff, you become a time hacker, getting more stuff done in what really is the same amount of time. Boredom is your enemy. Burn the bridge, buy the ticket, hire the tutor, order the cab. Take action now and thank yourself later. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not consider purchasing one of the books that inspired today's show? It helps the authors who write, me who produces, and you who implements. Thanks for watching, share your thoughts below, strike a like, and if you're feeling really daring, hover over the subscribe button and see what happens.